Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Mr. Levin, for hosting us. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Michelle and Phil. I'll give you just a little bit more of a background about me. When I graduated from UCLA, I worked for a private foundation in Los Angeles, and then I decided to do Aliyah in 1993, and I came there and I said, I'm a philanthropy professional, this is what I know how to do. And they said to me, oh, in Israel we don't have philanthropy, we have high tech, you should do high tech. So that is in fact what I ended up doing for 10 years. I worked in business development and marketing in the high tech industry until about 10 years ago when there was opportunity to go back into the world of philanthropy. And I think that opportunity was created because that's about when the philanthropic community in Israel began to evolve. I want to take you through a journey for the next half hour or so about the Israeli philanthropic community, because that community has opportunity and interest and potential where you are concerned, and I also think that you can serve a role in encouraging that philanthropic community. But to speak about that, I need to step back and talk about Israel 65 years ago. When Israel was formed 65 years ago, it went from a population of 650,000 people to 1.3 million people in a very short period of time. It was a country of immigrants, a country of very poor immigrants who came in, unskilled labor, most of them post-trauma from either the Holocaust or from Northern Africa. A lot of unskilled labor, very poor infrastructures, and what we had was a government that chose to be very socialist in its economy, high level of government intervention to allow for those infrastructures to build. Also, we didn't have that many people of wealth in Israel 65 years ago, and the equation was very clear. It was the job of the diaspora philanthropy to fund the Jewish homeland, and it was the job of the Israelis to sow and plow and build and fight for the country. It's not to say that there wasn't Israeli philanthropy 65 years ago. There was. There were people like the Rekanati families, if some of you are familiar with them. They are a family, a third-generation family that came from Saloniki in Greece, a merchant and banking family. They have been very traditional givers in Israel. Over the years, we have the Strauss family up north, you know, the Strauss dairy empire. They are very involved in doing philanthropy in Israel. But for the most part, it wasn't until about 15 years ago that more and more Israelis attained substantial wealth, and with that also started to explore their social responsibility. Why is that important to you? Why should you care about there being a vibrant Israeli philanthropic community? In the 10 years that I've been working with overseas funders in Israel, they've been asking, and rightfully so, where are the Israelis? It was okay 65 years ago for us to fund the building of the Jewish homeland, but now we see prosperity. We see high-tech prosperity, we see industry prosperity. Where are the Israelis? We want to partner with them, and they're right about that. You should be partnering with the Israelis because A, it's time for them to take responsibility, also philanthropic responsibility for their country. Not all of it, but a little bit of it. And also, they have some on-the-ground knowledge that is very valuable when you want to be giving in Israel. When you have a partner who's well-connected in government, who knows the municipalities, who knows the issues, it is a very different kind of giving when you do that with a local partner than when you do it alone remotely. I will give you an example just from recently. You know, we had our short-lived Pillar of Cloud operation a couple of weeks ago. And I coordinated the desk for emergency funding for the philanthropic community. And what we had, it's a very different kind of giving when you know someone like Yehudit Yovel Rekanati, who founded the Hotline for Trauma and Terror, when she knows what the on-the-ground needs are right now. It is very different for when an overseas funder can call her and say, hey, Judith, what do you guys need right now? It's different from giving through the federation system, which it's very important to have the infrastructures, but when you want to do something that you know exactly where your dollars went. I had a funder call me in the second day of the operation and say, hey, what's being done with the Bedouin community? They're being affected by the rockets and the missiles. Their children are traumatized. Not only are they traumatized, but they're very ambivalent. In one sense, they're scared, and in another sense, they have an identity issue. You know, they kind of don't know who or what they are right now. They have family in Gaza, but they're also Israelis, but they're still children who are being bombarded. And what we were doing during that week, during those 8 days, we were sending buses, many, many buses of kids to go up north and just take a day's break from being in the shelters. We had the National Emergency Authority of Israel, which is an authority of the Office of Homeland Defense, prioritized for us. They said the greatest need right now is get the kids out of there for a day. We take them to their uncles, take them to the safari, take them somewhere. We had a lot of northern communities accepting the children and entertaining them for a day. But the Bedouin children didn't have anybody funding the buses, and if they did get out, they had nowhere to go because there weren't hosting communities hosting them. So this particular funder who called me funded the buses and the visit to the safari, and 13 buses left the next day from Rahat, from the Bedouin community, because of a connection that we had on the ground. So having those connections are very important, and they're very tangible. You can feel, if you want to do hands-on philanthropy, it's a very different experience. But first I want to talk to you about the Israeli community, the Israeli philanthropic community. And what you can see on the slide are the fast facts about who, not who, but how many are giving this day in Israel. We have 1,000 people in Israel, about 1,000 people in Israel, giving $25,000 or more. Why am I saying about and I'm not specific? Because like the IRS, which is very transparent about giving information, we don't have the Israeli tax authority being transparent in that information. So we can guesstimate. But since these numbers are not very large, we can pretty much put a name to every number here. Of those 1,000 people, we only have 15 Israeli foundations. 15 Israeli foundations. Why so little? I'll explain that in a minute. We have 1,000 givers now, so 1,000 substantial givers, but we have the potential. JP Morgan Wealth Report came out in June, and it indicated that there are 10,000 Israelis living in Israel with the potential of giving $25,000 or more. So we have the potential to see this philanthropic community grow a lot more than it is now. And the question is, why hasn't it grown? Well, the first thing, it hasn't grown because it's young. It's only in the last 15 years or so that people have really made substantial wealth in numbers, in many numbers. But there are also some social, cultural, and structural reasons why we're not seeing as many Israeli philanthropists. It starts with what I started in the beginning. Israel was a socialist economy until not so long. It was a collective society until not so long ago. The kibbutzim, the all for one and one for all. We're a society and an economy in transition. We are moving into a capitalist system, and we have people of wanting to be individual, but on another hand, we're still very stuck on it's the government's responsibility. In the States, when you have a particular issue, let's say a new medical issue in your family, you turn to that association. You don't turn to government. If you have a child born with cystic fibrosis, you will turn to the Cystic Fibrosis Association. In Israel, you turn to government. Anything that happens, you turn to government. And that's remnants of a system, of an economy that was there a few decades ago. By the way, this is not so different from the economy of the US in the beginning. The first administrations of the US was also very high on government intervention because this country as well was a country of immigrants, a country of poor infrastructures, and in the beginning it required all these social services to be provided by government. It's only as it evolved that you could move into more of a laissez-faire. But in Israel, a lot of the funders are people who lived in Israel 60 years ago, who remember the socialist government, and they say it's government's responsibility. And add to that, Israelis say, I'm doing plenty. I live here, I go to the army, my kids go to the army, I do reserve duty until my 40s or 50s, I pay a very high level of taxes, I'm doing plenty. There's another cultural issue that is very important to understand about Israel. Philanthropy is not a defining characteristic of the elite. You do not have to be a giver to be accepted into society, into the high net worth society. It is just not expected. People can do a big exit in the high-tech industry, make hundreds of millions of dollars, and they don't, it is not expected of them to give back to society. It's just a cultural issue. By the way, in Britain, it's the same. Britain also has a country that there isn't a culture of giving, and they're struggling with the same issue of creating, defining a different culture for themselves as well. We also don't have role models. We don't have, you can say good and bad things, but you have some incredible role models in this country. You have the Gates, and you have the Carnegies, and you have some amazing people doing amazing work. You have 90 some odd people who decided to join the Giving Pledge, pledging most of their, or at least 50% of their funds to charity in their lives or after. We don't have one Giving Pledge candidate in Israel, not one. There's also that perception, if you look at the media in Israel and the coverage of philanthropy and philanthropists, there is more negative media than positive media. It is more perceived to be something of getting something from government favoritism, rather than altruism, rather than just good, clean stories about good people trying to do something good. And if that's not enough, every once in a while there's a story about a nonprofit gone bad, about high salaries, about corruption, but those are very few, but that makes good media. So when someone acquires wealth, they say, oh yes, but I've heard of those stories. Ellen before mentioned the tax deductions in the States and the caps and changes that are probably going to be made. In Israel, it's the other way around. We don't have tax incentives almost at all. And altruism is one good reason to give, but tax incentives is another very good reason to give, and we don't have those. Whereas you have, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but whereas you have tax deductions in the US, we only have a tax credit. Not only that, our credit has a cap of $2.5 million. So if you're a high net worth donor, and you want to give more than $2.5 million, you're not even going to get your tax credit on that amount. Secondly, there are very few, except for very few exceptions, there is no reason to set up, there isn't a tax reason to set apart money in a fund for philanthropy. We don't get any tax advantages for that. And for that reason, even the 15 foundations that I had mentioned before are not really foundations. They're virtual foundations, they're a logo, they're stationary, but it's not a corpus. It's not someone actually setting that funds aside because they don't get an advantage to doing that, so they might as well just write a check every year. That's why also you don't see endowments in the big universities and the big hospitals. There just aren't endowments in Israel, which when you look at long-term sustainability of philanthropy, that is a big problem.